he's one of these foundational members of the land system science community. It is a very new community, I guess, since the 2000s in terms of scientific, I guess, discipline. But Earle was one of these people that helped make it happen. And anyway, he's a professor at the University of Maryland in the Department of Geography and Environmental Systems, currently a presidential research professor there, as well as also being a visiting fellow at the Oxford Martin School. And his work is on the ecology of human-managed ecosystems at multiple scales. And he leads a group called the Anthropocene Lab. And it looks at these long-term couplings between humans and the environment. He does this at really a lot of different scales, like I just said. So he's put together some great global understanding of couplings and the influence of humans within these systems, including the emergence of agricultural societies. So in addition to being a really good scientist and, a highly cited researcher, there's much more to his impact. He's involved in a lot of science policy interface communities, the IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. He led the Transformative Change. He was a lead author in the Transformative Change one. And he's also a fellow and former member of the Science Steering Committee of the Global Land Program. And he's also a senior fellow of the Breakthrough Institute. This is my final point, is that he writes for popular audiences too. So you can find his articles in the New York Times, in the New Scientist, opinions and commentary in Nature and Science, stuff like that. So what's great about this presentation, I'm sure, and just Earle and his work in general, is that he has this great overview of things over time and space, but also can communicate it to a lot of different audiences. So with that, I will actually let him have a chance to speak, and let's welcome him with a round of applause.
It's really an honor to be here. Famous building. I've heard of the Attenborough building, and now I'm actually here, so that's a wonderful thing. One thing she didn't mention too is I'm actually in the UK a fair amount this year. I'm on sabbatical at Oxford, the Oxford Martin School, and also working with Yad Ben-Gurmali in his Leverhulme Center for Nature Recovery, which is something that we'll connect with a bit today. So I'm basically going to talk about three things. And the first is that when you think about ecology, it's very common in the discipline to just think about ecology as this thing that only nature is really important when you think about ecology. But as we'll see, at least in the terrestrial ecology of the planet, it's really a human ecology and has been for a very long time. And I'll talk about why in the big picture. Why is this one species so important to the ecology of an entire planet? That's very unusual. Most species are just fitting into their place. Why is everything getting changed so much by this one species? And then we'll talk about some of the more traditional and indigenous forms of ecology that have been shaped in a way that is different than the traditional narrative that humans are a disturbance, that they're producing a damage. Or I've even heard recently a term that I've never heard, but it feel like is almost embarrassing at this time in history. Humans are noise ecology. I think we really need to move beyond that. And we got to go even that next step. The next step, the most important step, the step that's really going to change the world, is when we're able to embrace the role that we have, rather than just trying to avoid changing the world. We have to engage with the world to change it for the better. So let's jump into this. Oh, it's still not working. Maybe just the
enter. Okay.
Yeah, that's working. Okay. So I often show this slide, and everyone in this room has seen an image exactly like this before, right? This is a planet that at night, phenomena you can observe from a telescope from Mars or very far out, right? This is a simple observable fact about the planet that you can observe. What is the cause? So you're trying to understand the cause of the planet glowing at night. And it would be tempting to say, well, it must be physics. We can use physics to understand how the Earth is glowing at night. Of course, can you use physics? No. Can you use chemistry to explain why the planet glows at night? No. Can you use biology to explain why the planet glows at night? And probably most of you are biologists. I'm trained as a biologist. You can't use biology to understand this, right? It's not because there's so many people and people glow that the planet glows at night. What is this process that we need to understand a planet that has started to glow at night? We need to understand the social processes that enabled this species to build this infrastructure, to figure out how to do it, to actually construct it across the planet and light it up. So that is the process that we would need to understand. And then there's some very simple questions about a process caused by something, right? It's a human caused process. So let's just turn it off, switch it off. We're under control, right? It's our process. And I think you all know, right? We can't do that. There's nobody, there's no we, there's no dashboard, there's no control room, there's no control panel for cockpit on planet Earth, right? We are basically changing the planet without any ability to actually manage this change. And that is really our condition in the Anthropocene, right? And the big question is, will we gain some capacity to actually not just unintentionally shape the functioning of this planet? Can we do it in a way that is actually what we intend? That is the grand challenge of the Anthropocene, is to gain some agency over what we're actually doing already. So there's a lot of narratives connected with the Anthropocene that are also connected to conservation. And this is a classic one, right? It's in actually even in the IPBES report, this idea that this planet is now entering another mass extinction caused by human societies. And I think it's really important to think about what these kinds of narratives do and whether they actually are supported by science. And you could, and I think it is absolutely true, that extinctions are increasing and that this is caused by humans and that this is a tremendous problem that we need to get under control because this is a terrible thing. Nobody really wants this to happen, but it is happening and it's getting worse. So we have to do something about it. Are we in a 6 mass extinction? Not even close. It would take hundreds of years, centuries, to get to halfway of species being extinct. Okay, so we are so far from a mass extinction. This is not a mass extinction. You are not in mass extinction. You are in a time when you have to do something about extinction. But the idea that we are already entering a mass extinction is basically the same message as giving up on what people are capable of doing. That is not the message that we need, right? We have a problem that we need to deal with, and we can. We are not in the mass extinction. We are in a position to do something better with biodiversity. What's behind this? Well, the number one factor, pretty much everywhere, landscapes, skyscapes, it's use. Human use of these places has limited the availability of habitat, changed the condition of habitat in ways that other species who are not tolerant of the human world, and there's a lot of them, maybe most of them, and we see those extinctions as a result. So land use is considered the biggest threat to biodiversity. And this is not a new narrative. And one of those examples of the kind of land use change that is contributing to these extinctions is tropical deforestation. But it's very easy to think of tropical deforestation as some kind of new thing, as something that humans only in this industrial age are producing. But if you are somebody who knows about the deep history of Amazonia, and the evidence just continues to grow, and that will continue with archaeology, right? Archaeology only gets more evidence. That only pushes it out, the influence of humans, it only pushes it deeper. Okay, so even now, it's very clear that most of Amazonia has some form of historical human use. This is actually revealed by deforestation, that there were people there before. This is not a building foundation. This is a geoglyph, a cultural earthwork of earlier Amazonian peoples. Okay, so there's nothing new about people reshaping the planet. Megafauna extinctions, okay? Some of the most consequential extinctions that have ever occurred on Earth were not caused by industrial societies, right? These are hunter-gatherer societies. They're not agricultural societies. They're doing this through the social capacities of small-scale societies. So the idea that it's just about the industrial world is the most impactful is also not correct if you understand the deeper history. And when we look at places like Amazonia, and I do focus a fair amount in this narrative here on Amazonia because it holds such a privileged position in people's minds about the biosphere. What is nature? A lot of people think, oh, tropical rainforest is nature. This place is just as much nature as a tropical rainforest, but it doesn't come to mind. But Amazonia does, and Amazonia is not a wild place. It's a place that's largely been transformed by human societies over thousands of years. That's through the distribution of plant species, for example. It's not as simple as just this wild place without people. Archaeologists are not good at doing global change work. I learned that from working with a lot of archaeologists. Archaeologists are fantastic at reconstructing a local history, a narrative of a place. That's what they really do focus on. When trying to build a global understanding of the earlier history of Earth's transformation, it took some help. So we worked together on a project called the Archaeoglobe Project, where we actually put together what's considered to just be common knowledge. This stuff is obvious to archaeologists. It's just not obvious to earth scientists who make this amazing assumption that if there's no evidence of people, it must all be natural. So when they don't have the evidence, we just have a wild planet. Nothing happened because of people until 1950 or something like that, because there's so much evidence then. Well, for the people who have the evidence, it's really obvious that's not true. And so putting it together in a form that earth scientists can understand, a global representation of the archaeological knowledge, actually is starting to change things. And the global models that are used to describe the planet are now starting to incorporate some facts like the planet has been used for thousands of years, mostly used. We'll get more into the details of that. So this kind of classic model of ecology, what are the global patterns of life? These are taught to little children in kindergarten, right? Tropical rainforests are different than deserts, and the world is diverse in this natural way. Well, these are the global patterns shaped by climate, right? That's what the natural biomes are. And these are still important and real, but the idea that that's it, that's the way we're going to understand the global patterns of life doesn't make a whole lot of sense when most of the planet has actually been transformed by human use of land. In fact, if you want to be a species that lives anywhere in this whole country, most of the issue is going to be what is going on with the human world. How have humans shaped essentially the biomes? And we use this term anthromes to describe the human shape, not just the climate shape patterns of life on Earth, the human shape patterns of life on Earth. And we've even taken that and using models to reconstruct the past global history of land use and population, we can show that according to the best models, and I don't trust these things very much, no one should, right? These are really rough, but according to the best models that we have, I think the most interesting simple thing here is to go all the way back 12,000 years ago, right? That's the end of the last ice age. The estimates that we have show that about 1/4 of the terrestrial biosphere at that time is in this category of anthrome we call wildlands. There's no evidence of human populations or intensive use of land at that time. So that's only about 1/4. That's 12,000 years ago. Now we're at about 85% is in these kinds of anthromes that are either, that are not free of human use. Okay, so that's the big story. And so very early on, we have these transformative changes caused by human use of land. There's so many changes like this. Okay, land use is a big one, and land use is driving a lot of these changes. I think everybody here probably knows that the biggest changer of global climate until 1950 was land use, only surpassed by the industrial emissions from fossil fuel combustion primarily in the 1950s. So until then, it was all driven by land use. And there's a much earlier history of climate change connected with land use as well from thousands of years ago. But many different forms of change, including biodiversity change, of course, many changes. All right, so now what I want to talk about a little more is why. Why do we have a planet that's being rapidly transformed by people and has been for a very long time, in fact? Again, the first law of the Anthropocene, this is a planet that is reshaped by human societies and that it's not going to stop. There's no way this will stop. The only question is, what form is it going to take? What's it going to look like, what we do in the future? That's wide open. So a theory that I call anthropology theory and the underlying process we'll talk about is an evolutionary process. And you have to expand your understanding, or extend is the proper term, your understanding of evolution by natural selection. You have to add a few things to understand why this process is going on. So let me see if I can do that real quick. You know, the classic view of how organisms adapt to the environment and evolve is this very simple narrative where you have organisms, the biota of the planet, and you, of course, have the abiotic environment like, climate, soils, this sort of thing. Okay, and organisms have to adapt to that. They have to adapt to the climate, just like a tropical rainforest needs to live where it's warm and wet, right? They're adapted to. So it's a really simple model of evolution. We call this the one-way street, right? Organisms have to adapt to an environment that they don't control. don't shape. Okay, simple. But of course, most species don't just passively deal with their environment. They also shape their environment. Think of any species that produces a nest. This is a classic example of the beaver because it builds stuff that looks a lot like our stuff, where the environment is being reshaped to improve it for the reproductive success of this organism, okay? So the process is called ecosystem engineering. I think everyone's familiar with that. Maybe most of you know that there's also an evolutionary theory tied to that. When an organism alters its environment in a way that affects its ability to survive and reproduce, in other words, has an adaptive component, changes the selective force, that's called niche construction. The niche is being constructed by that species. Okay, so that's the first thing we need to understand. Well, it sounds familiar, right? There's a species that does that. Bacteria do this too, just to be clear. It's not just humans. A lot of species do this. Okay, so that creates what we call the two-way street, right? Organisms not only have to adapt to their environment, they can also change the environment. And then it gets more complicated, right? They change the environment, then they have to adapt to the changed environment. You start getting a feedback and you get a much more complicated evolutionary process. Again, not unique to humans, but something that changes things. All right, another thing, and this is hot in biology now, right, is animal cultures, right? Humans are not the only species with cultures. There's a lot of species that have culture, right? Culture is really important to survival and reproduction of species, right? That's called social learning, is when organisms learn from each other to, in this case, reproduce. This species has to learn the songs, the mating songs it needs to reproduce. It needs to learn those from other individuals in its environment in order for it to be able to reproduce successfully. So it's an example of culture and cultural inheritance. Okay, so again, not unique to people. All right, so that's another thing we need to understand about this sociocultural and niche construction. And then finally, we have to talk about sociality, right? There's lots of social species. Social species are nothing new. They're hundreds of millions of years old. You're all familiar with them. But here's the most important thing about the sociality of pretty much all other species that we know, is that it's entirely biological, okay? The individuals in a society are all incredibly highly biologically related. Sometimes they're even, just brothers and sisters. That's it. Okay, so that's one thing to understand. But maybe the most important thing to understand is that the social relationships that determine things as simple as like how many individuals live in a colony of a certain species of wasp. All you need to know is what species it is, and it can tell you. You can see how many individuals in that population because it's all determined biologically. Sociality, social structure, it's all biological. How many people can live in a human society? How big are human societies? You can't answer that question. We don't know. It can be small. We are now at billions. Could be bigger. Definitely. We don't know. It's an unknown. It's open-ended. And it's because it's cultural. Our social processes are socially learned. You have to learn to be in your society. Your biology doesn't tell you what to do. If you're in a hunter-gatherer society and somebody puts you on a jet airplane and gives you $1,000, you could be a billionaire in New York City. People are learning to live in their societies through culture. So our sociality is entirely cultural. It's evolving. As our culture evolves, our societies change. Completely open-ended. We don't know how big, what kind of societies could be created because they can constantly evolve. And they have. We also have some other extraordinary things. Most social species will only share in key resources like food and shelter with other highly related individuals. All of you today have already received what you needed to survive, like your food, from somebody you don't know, right? That is normal for human beings. It's not normal for other species, right? We have an open-ended type of sociality as well that we call that non-kin subsistence exchange. But the bottom line is we have a cultural sociality, and we're also incredibly good at social learning, right? Our cultures accumulate. That's also considered exceptional. Other species have cultures, but they don't just get more and more culture, right? We can add our cultures up. For example, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. If you're building an airplane, you don't have to think, how am I going to put wheels on this thing? You already have wheels. You already know how to do that. Stuff builds up. It accumulates. We put all those ideas together. We have culture, right? We are social. We make our niche socially, and we have niche construction. You put those concepts together, those capabilities together, socially learned and socially enacted niche construction, and you can understand why we are able to change the environment in ways that support us, in ways that were never existed before. And that is evolving, right? There's not an end to this. It continues to evolve, just like species continue to evolve. Our socio-cultural niche construction just continues to evolve. New forms of social exchange, new forms of niche construction in terms of building environments that sustain us. All these things are evolving, and they've evolved ever since we've been human. And let's not forget, okay, big transformative things like the use of fire, which is one of the most transformative things we've ever learned to do. We didn't even learn it, right? That's not Homo sapiens. That's an earlier species of Homo. We evolved, Homo sapiens evolved among other species of Homo that already had fire and already had some tools and probably already had a lot of social capabilities. So it's been really a big picture change in the whole planet when we gain these capabilities. But the most important thing here is to understand what this means for long-term changes. Now, this does appear like just a linear arrow, right? That's my bad. Just seemed like an easy way to illustrate this. It looks like everything just goes in a direction. Evolution doesn't just go in a direction. We all know that, right? It produces diversity. Some of these societies are still here, and they are just as adaptive as they were 10,000 years ago, right? Living in the tropical rainforest societies that still use a lot of the traditional techniques, and they still work. So there's nothing about this that talks about progress, but it does talk about a fact that some of the later stages are things that build on top of earlier ones. So we do see that pattern, all right? And so societal scales is an obvious one, right? This, 12,000 years ago, the largest scale human society you were going to likely see was just a few dozen people, okay? And obviously now we have a planetary scale, almost. Who knows exactly how to describe it, but it's certainly at the hundreds of millions we have societies. So that's evolving over time, societal scale. But what is, I think, the most interesting here, and I sometimes call that niche construction intensity too, here it's called land use intensity, is that as these societies scale up, in parallel, we see another pattern. The amount of land necessary to sustain one person in that society has gone down, right? That isn't a narrative you get, right? The idea that you normally hear is that industrial societies use more land per person than the more traditional or past societies. That's wrong. We use less land per person. Now, the big difference is we transform it a lot more. So the land that sustains you is completely different than a wildland. Whereas in a more earlier society, or some of the societies now that use some of these other techniques like burning the landscape, they use a lot more land per person, but they don't change it as much. We'll talk a little bit about what that means in a minute, but that's a process that we see. Intensification, so more intensive use, less land per person in societies. We also have learned to use more non-human energy to do this. That's one of the reasons we're even able to do this, is that you don't just have to do this yourself, right? How much energy of your own do you use to get your food? Very little, maybe none, okay? Now that didn't used to be true. It was all pretty much human energy, except the first thing, right? We just said humans evolved, Homo sapiens evolved among other Homo species that use fire. What does fire do? Well, it turns out fire is a way of not using your own biological energy to digest food. And that frees up a large amount of energy. Some anthropologists have argued that this is what enabled Homo sapiens to have a large brain, is it freed up enough energy. Cooking food freed up enough energy that you could actually have a large brain that was fed with all these extra calories that you gained by using some biomass to light up and cook your food. So an energy substitution. But of course that increases over time, and the real drama, right? There's obviously a lot of biomass increase, burning stuff, making charcoal and all. But then the really big change, of course, is the use of fossilized biomass, right? That's what really has got us into the soup these days. We've unleashed this huge amount of biomass that was stored up over 100 million years that is basically biomass from the past, and we're burning it. It's changing the planet, but it's made it possible for all of us not to use our own, right? We freed it all up. So energy substitution is huge, and it continues, okay? And what's interesting now is a lot like plants. We can get energy for our society from the sun directly. No biosphere involved. That's pretty special, right? No other species has that but plants. Of course, there's nuclear energy, other forms of energy that are not from the biosphere. How much energy can human beings use? Also don't know. We start harnessing wind, solar, nuclear, maybe fusion someday, right? This is energy substitution. It makes possible things that were never possible before. You put all those things together, it's pretty obvious, right? Where are we going with this? We don't know, but it's going to be transformative. It's going to change the world like it has been in the past. And again, I always kind of walk back a little bit from that, those arrows. These arrows are not going in a specific direction, okay? Societies go all over the place. Diversity is what evolution produces, right? Extinctions of societies happen, right? You can see the relics of the Romans everywhere, right? They disappeared, but they're not totally gone. The languages that we speak are pretty much versions of Roman languages. But the bottom line is it's a diversification process. It's not directional, not really that directional. But one thing we know for sure is that in this human age, the Anthropocene, the ecological changes that we see are shaped by the cultural changes of human societies. As we learn new capabilities, we can do things differently. And we have for a very long time. That's kind of where the ship is going, is where our cultures are going. And just to give a little background here, again, we're going to talk about the idea that human shaping of ecology isn't just this impact, footprint, disturbance, noise. It's much more than that. It's a relationship. It's a different kind of relationship. It's transformative and it changes things in all sorts of ways. So it's not just as simple as damaging stuff. Although the idea of burning, well, what does burning do? Why would people burn the landscape if they want to have it live in it? Well, it turns out actually earlier successional stages produce a lot more growth than an old growth forest does. That food that you get there and the other species in the environment know this and they go there too. Everyone who's an ecologist knows that. You have a fire, wait a year, everything wants to go there because all the food's there. All right, it's a way of increasing the productivity of an environment. It's a kind of niche construction. So this is also ancient. I'm not going to go into dietary broadening, but it's basically learning to use more species in your environment. It's something that all of the earlier societies do. And of course, you can get more food out of the same environment if you know how to use more species. And that's what people learn to do over time, especially when they get confronted like things like you're the woolly mammoth people and you've driven the woolly mammoth extinct. You got to diversify. People learn to do that. And then, of course, you start getting into these things that soon put you on the path to agriculture, like propagating your favorite species. That's transformed Amazonia. The favorite species of earlier people are all over. Cashew nut, Brazil nut, classic example of this, right? The distribution of Brazil nut is produced through humans moving around their favorite species. And then, of course, we get to the intensification that's familiar to anyone who studies land use. I think most land use scientists aren't so familiar with hunter-gatherer intensification, but for archaeologists, this isn't like an advanced idea. This is the normal understanding of how things have changed. But with agriculture, you definitely have a very simple example here of intensification. As the demand for resources from the land increases and land becomes less available, usually through some kind of population growth or migration or whatever, you're going to have a more intensive practice will be adopted. And this is because it's not that people invent the more intensive ways to use the landscape, like using the plow or something like that, or tilling more frequently. If they don't do it because they invented for this purpose, they already know how to do this. It's not worth putting in the extra labor. Nobody's going to work really hard to produce tons of food if you don't need the food. Intensification is driven by demand. It's not just driven by technology. It's driven by demand. That's what changes intensification. Another process, right, is urbanization. In fact, arguably, it's the biggest transformative change that we see on the planet now. Why do people concentrate into dense settlements? Well, truth is they've done this since ancient times, right? This is not a new thing. And I have another slide that I often show, I took out, that shows how this works even in smaller scale settlements. Larger scale settlements have more opportunities. You can make more out of your social relationships when you have more of them, and you will have more of them in a dense settlement. So there's this return on going to the cities, and that's been driving change for a long time. but it's really moving fast now. We passed the 50% mark. More than half of all people on Earth live in cities now, and that's going fast. And most of that urbanization, reason it doesn't seem like a big deal for most of you is because this place urbanized a long time ago, but most of the human beings on this planet are still in the urbanization phase. And we're seeing that it's changing the world. It's very rapid. It may not look beautiful. Like I chose this image intentionally. It's not all beautiful. It's not all in a place you've heard of, but it is changing the world. And the biggest effect of urbanization is outside the city, okay? The supporting infrastructure, the abilities to sustain all these people in these dense settlements, it doesn't happen in the city. It happens everywhere else. So the kinds of production systems that can sustain the wealthiest people on Earth live in cities, and even the poorer people in the city are wealthier usually than their companions in the countryside. Those populations get serviced by the largest scale production systems that exist. And those systems are less interested in using marginal lands. For example, the best lands get monopolized by them, and they get completely transformed with huge amounts of energy, like we were talking about before, changing the planet. Now, this sounds like kind of bad news. And there is this thing, another slide I took out is my favorite slide, solving a problem by creating a bigger problem. That is a classic solution that human societies have been doing for a long time, and it kind of has worked in that you can keep doing it, you think? But the bottom line is, what's going on today? What's our situation? And there's two really interesting things that are not the narrative that you usually hear. You usually hear this narrative is like, population's growing out of control. Complete BS, right? Anyone who knows, if you actually know the facts, human population is crashing, right? We're seeing a crash of the birth rate and the replacement rate. It's at this point where we're going to see a shrinking of population at some time in this century, almost certainly. And that's relatively easy to predict compared to a lot of things in the future. But it's pretty well predicted. So we're going to see a population that's leveling off. That's something we haven't seen in human societies for more than 100 years. That's what we're going to be facing in the next 50 years. Is that. But the other is even more interesting is that as we're seeing this leveling off, we're also seeing that intensification is really replacing the extensive use of land. Now, we showed a picture early on of tropical deforestation. Agriculture is moving around the world, but the total amount of intensively used land for agriculture has more or less stabilized decades ago. It's partly because there isn't that much good land to move into, but the bottom line is it's more or less leveled off the total amount of agricultural land. Now that does include a lot of low intensity use, and it doesn't deal with the fact that it's moving around like it's going to the tropics. But this is what we see. And at the same time that population has been exploding, we had a lot of population growth, massive, more food produced per person. That doesn't mean more food in people's mouths necessarily, right? You can produce the food, and for some reason, some people go hungry. Do you have any hungry people in Cambridge? Absolutely. And there are people that probably can't afford it or have some issues with money, or the food system isn't servicing them. That is what caused shortage of food. There is plenty of food on this planet. A lot of it's fed to animals, et cetera, et cetera. But the bottom line is more food produced per person at the same time that population has grown, right? So we don't have a shortage of food, and we're not anticipating one. Okay, so that's kind of good news, isn't it? It's not the bad future that people talk about. And at the same time, we're seeing, as a result of intensification, land use moving around the world, we're seeing a lot of recovery of ecology. You see that. I think you're seeing some of it in the UK. I studied that across China, and it really shocked me just how much land was regenerating forests, for example, as the more marginal lands of the world, especially in the temperate zone, are abandoned because only lands that people want to really use in the developed world are the most productive ag lands. So we have a lot of possibilities. And a lot of ecologists see this slide and they just think it's the end of the world because we have human capabilities like this. But I think of it this way. We live in the most capable, interconnected, interdependent societies that have ever existed. We are globally connected, globally dependent. We may not act like it, but this is the fact of the matter. We have the ability to change the world. We have that capability. We're not at the mercy of the planet. Okay. Now, whether we will use this opportunity to take our capabilities and create this better future is up to us. But the idea that those capabilities don't exist, it's not true. the capabilities exist to shape a much better future. So there's another question that we should be asking. This question about whether we can stop destroying the planet is really a low bar. It's not the right way of thinking about it. The really question is, where are we going with this? And probably the best question of all is, who are we? That's, as I said from the beginning, probably the biggest challenge of the Anthropocene is there is no we. There's lots of people with different ways of thinking about a better future, right? So that's the challenge. It's not easy. I'm not saying there's any easy solutions here, but that is the challenge, really. Can we come together to some degree to do things together in ways that we all appreciate? That is, in a sense, the big question. And there's lots of opportunities for this. And one of the older ones in the industrial world that people talk about is, right, we can set some land aside. We don't have to transform everything. We can save places and conserve places that we believe in. And I think everyone knows this is the very famous park, Yosemite Valley, right? And maybe most of you here know that there was another valley, well, it still is there. There's another valley nearby called Hetch Hetchy. And John Muir proposed that Hetch Hetchy also be conserved, but it is now a reservoir for the city of San Francisco. It used to look almost exactly like this. And there's a lot of talk about actually draining the reservoir and restoring it. These are choices. This is not nature. This is the choice about human societies, what we want out of the future. And there's a lot of effort to set aside more areas for the rest of nature to live in. Protected areas have been growing, and there's a lot of ambition in growing it more. There's ambitions. This isn't the ultimate ambition in a way. This is half of Earth that has been set aside and connected together using computers to optimize where that goes. So we have the solution. Does this seem like a little troubling? Well, what if your house is there? You get someone comes up to your neighborhood and says, well, you're looking at, yeah, sorry, your house is going to have to be destroyed because we've got this plan. Is this how it's going to work? It's a nice idea. I can understand the ambition, but it's not going to work like this, is it? There's no no planner can do this. This idea that stewardship of the earth is going to come through the experts deciding what's right and then explaining to people what to do is not the model that will actually work. It's a nice idea. It's important to have expertise in the process, but the idea that it's just a planning process, an observing process, creating a dashboard for the planet is going to do this, I don't think so. This is the biosphere that we have. Right? We have a used biosphere, right? There's not all this land just sitting there waiting to be conserved. We just have to do the conservation, right? This is a relationship with most of the planet, a transformed planet. About 40% of all the land on Earth is in some form of intensive use. About 20% is still in that category we could call wild, that doesn't have evidence, at least in the global data. I think the global data is pretty poor. It should actually be a smaller number. About 20%, not intensively used, not populated. And then there's this stuff. What the heck is that? Okay, this, you know what it is. This, you know, this is the stuff in between. This is the stuff embedded in our intensively used landscapes. We don't just do the intensive use here and leave all the rest, right? What does the biosphere look like? The biosphere mostly looks like this. Okay, it's a combination. It's a mess. It's a mosaic. It's a mixture of the intensively used landscapes that are necessary to sustain human societies and the stuff in between. And it's all over the place, the stuff in between. Some of it is just a remnant of what was there before. No one's done much to change it. And some of it is just regrown after being used for 100 years for agriculture. It's all different kinds of stuff. But it's usually it's where the habitats that we have left. It's all the habitat left in UK for sure. And most of Europe, it's all in this category of something embedded in the used landscape that's not used so intensively and has some good habitat values for other species. So we can't understand land use change and the way it affects biodiversity at the scale of land use. We have to understand it at the scale of a landscape. The landscape scale defines the biodiversity you're going to see. How do those land uses interact together, conservation and other things? And fortunately, the science of understanding how to conserve biodiversity, you know, it started off with this simple ideas. You just set aside a place and good to go, right? It's safe. Everything's going to be fine, right? We now know as scientists that doesn't work, especially if those places are small and not connected to others. We've learned that. And I think where we're going now is we're learning that, well, if the social practices in that protected landscape don't work, you don't have species there in the future. So we're seeing an evolution of thinking about this. And this is what really sharing the earth looks like. It's really a process of negotiation of people in a place that know their places and care about their places and work in those places with other needs. It's all coming together that way. So really the Anthropocene opportunities aren't out there for conservation, right? They're right where we are. There's really very few places where we are not, right? We're all over the place. So it's really about how we put together conservation and land use into the same places. And it sounds all good, right? Oh, we'll just do conservation in the human world in one place. Well, as we know, right, this is how you get killed by a deer. Deer usually can't kill anybody, but you can get killed by a deer in this way, and it's by putting together two uses at the same time, right? These are two types of transportation. The wild world is got to get around, we got to get around, and it's the opposite of synergy, it's conflict. That's just as likely. But the good thing is we're not stuck in the past. We can do things differently. When we think about what it means to build a highway, we might start thinking, as we have, and in fact, creating rules. Like when you build a highway now in a lot of parts of the world, parts of Canada, parts of Europe, you have to have mobility for the other species. You have to build a bridge, you have to build a tunnel. That's how you build human mobility. When you change the rules, people are pretty good, strangely enough, at following these rules, and we can build transportation differently. Transportation will always be built in such a way that other species can move. This is a change that is happening that we can make. We can make it possible for other species to move. And we need to do it at scale. We can't just do it, a little bit at a time. We need to think big about this because a lot of species have to move across continents. So we really need to do this, not just at a small scale. We really need to share the planet at a very large scale. And fortunately, that's what's happening. People are starting to think about how to do this. This is something that is being implemented both from a kind of scientific network point of view, global capabilities to assess these things, put these things together. And I particularly like this concept. David Obura's, this is actually from David Obura, was leading this, of scapes. This idea that we are thinking about the landscapes, the seascapes, islandscapes, cryoscapes. We're looking at the landscape as being composed of these combinations of things, and that the really big opportunity is here. There's a lot of opportunity here too, but there's a lot of opportunity in the shared spaces of the planet. In fact, we looked at this a while ago when people were talking about half Earth, like, can you do it? Can you conserve half of Earth's land without basically making it impossible for people to eat? And we found that the answer is no, you can't, if you have to have everything in large wild landscapes. That's the only way you do conservation. You lose a huge amount of food production. If you want to share half of the planet, you have to use the shared landscapes. You have to allow there to be a lot of small scale conservation mixed in with agriculture. It's the only way you can get half without really having to push hard on people. We also looked at it this way. Again, a little bit like that scapes model of three kinds of landscape. I mean, obviously three is oversimplifying, but it's helpful to oversimplify it. Look at the shared lands, right? The shared lands are really the big picture. These are the landscapes that have, in this case, less than half of the landscape is intensively used. This is the big opportunity for conservation here on this planet. And you do things differently in these different landscapes. There's not a one size fits all approach globally either, but we do need to think, right? It's not just about protected areas. It's really about how to share landscapes. And that's really is the big opportunity in terms of what's available for the rest of life to live in. And people are starting to think about what do we do with those shared landscapes as we start to think about scaling up policy and ways of thinking about it. Like, for example, the idea that intensively used landscapes need to have mobility through them. They need a certain amount of interconnected habitat in order for that to work out in the long term. And there's some cost to this, but we're learning to do this stuff. And there's some really cool projects going on. Where even in the most intensively used landscapes for agriculture on the planet, like Iowa, where it's the corn belt, it's just walled, you go out there, you just see corn. They now are looking at ways of bringing in some kinds of native habitats, connected native habitats, and they're having some success in convincing some farmers to do this. It's a growing thing. It's a matter of improvement. And of course, some people have noticed, a lot of conservationists have noticed that, well, actually some of the most biodiverse areas of the world are definitely used by people, but they're not the same people as the industrial world is used to working with. These are the indigenous people of the world. And some may say, well, this is just an accident. It gets treated this way, like the indigenous people just happen to be in the most biodiverse areas. Wonder why? Well, there is an explanation for this. Like, first of all, this idea that, indigenous areas or even areas that are considered natural, an example of an assessment was called natural land. These places have used history, right? These aren't places without people. So get that out of your mind. There's not a whole lot of the earth that doesn't have people. And that's true even in the places that are considered conservation priority areas, highly biodiverse areas, they have people in them. And when we looked at the patterns of the anthromes, these global patterns of human use of land over the last 12,000 years, and we compared those with the existing contemporary patterns, a few different ones, the key biodiversity areas and species richness of this is just vertebrate species. I think a lot of you guys are familiar with that data set, Jenkins. Anyway, we saw that the biggest association between the global patterns of human use of land and those indicators of biodiversity priority is 500 years ago, not today. Right? So it's not just as simple as what we're doing today matters. There's a history of this. Again, wonder why? Well, there's another way to think about what it takes to have a lot of biodiversity on a planet that's been used for 12,000 years. Is it really depends on who's using it and what they're doing. Okay, and some people have been managing the landscapes different than industrial societies and different than the Romans, different than the intensive agriculture societies. They may be agricultural, but they're doing something a little different. Agricultural people are the ones who have managed to sustain the most diverse megafauna extemblages left on Earth, the Masai Mara. I think probably a lot of you have been there, right? It's an amazing place if you want to see the big five, you want to see some amazing wildlife, you go there. Well, this is actually land where the Maasai, who are pastoralists, they don't hunt, they just consume what they get from their animals. They have their livestock here too. You come another day, it's livestock here, okay? This is one of the most biodiverse places in the world. It's and they've kept other people from killing off the livestock. These kinds of landscapes, like in Amazonia, where are the most biodiverse landscapes? The places with no people? No. Go study it. You'll find that those old growth forests in the Amazonia are not the most biodiverse. They are the places that have lots of different patches of habitats with different stages of succession. Who makes those? Indigenous people are making a lot of them. Right? That's the way that they use the landscape. They use it a little bit here now, and then they go to another place, and they create this very complex set of different habitats in a mosaic, and that's where the biodiversity is. You want to see some biodiversity in Australia? A huge amount of it is maintained by fire. It's also, of course, cultural use of fire has prevented for long periods of time. You can look at the record in paleoecology, places that don't have gigantic fires. They just have little fires. This is a cultural practice of the Martu, for example, who have burned their landscapes for thousands of years. And those landscapes are more biodiverse than the ones that are not burned, where fire suppression has been applied and these people have been forced out of their traditional lands. So when we think about biodiversity as this thing that needs to be conserved by experts, it's not really true. The experts have done a pretty poor job when it comes to dealing with fire in the landscape, for example. Had to figure that out after a lot of big mistakes and a lot of costly destruction of ecosystems. The reality is that the people who live in the places that remain the most biodiverse actually know how to live in those landscapes and keep them biodiverse. It's actually an empirical fact. So that's an important thing to think about when we think about the future. And remember, this is a narrative in which people are connected with improving biodiversity. That's an important narrative. People are bringing that back. People are bringing cultures back, and more importantly, bringing people and cultures back together to assume those traditional life ways that did sustain biodiversity. This is something that's happening more and more. And even landscapes that are used don't have to just be sites of destruction. They can actually be very biodiverse. And even the global supply chains can be influenced to help maintain those kinds of things. So there's even a global connection possible with these kinds of traditional or even modern practices that involve sustaining biodiversity in the landscape at the same time you're using them. And this is the most important opportunity. So this is the last part of the talk. I know I've gone a little long here, is that things are moving forward. The cultures of nature are evolving. So hopefully this will be the most interesting part. So there's been a lot of change in the way that conservation is thought of and done. Now we're even at the stage with rewilding. So industrial societies have really changed their game. It's not like it's a constant, right? And I just want to tell a quick story. When I was in Beijing in 1990, my first winter there, it was really gray, dark. It was terrible. And spring comes and I go out to the park. I'm sitting there and it's getting a little greener. And I start to hear the birds singing in the trees. And I look around and they're all birds in cages. There's no wild birds in those trees, none. And that was pretty much what was going on back then. There was not a whole lot of wild biodiversity sitting around in Beijing. And people, this is what their ambition about having nature around you. Well, that's changed completely. China has changed completely. Okay. There was a time I was in Sichuan, there were posters up where I could go see a panda riding a motorcycle. Didn't actually see it, but that was considered cool. In 1990, it's not cool anymore. This is not cool actually either, but this guy's not abusing them. He is actually the biggest donor to panda conservation in the world. But this is the panda that Chinese people want now. They want a wild panda. That's what's cool for them. And they're willing to do the work. They are willing to wear the panda suit covered in panda urine in order to raise a panda that is wild, because that's what's cool. The aspirations for nature have changed. And it's not just this, narrative, it's a fact on the ground. Conservation in China, the game has changed completely. The amount of conservation effort, it's very possible that China will be one of the few countries in the world that meets all the international goals, while countries like here may not. Okay, the ambitions are there. They didn't used to be, it wasn't even on the radar. And there are these ambitions to go big on conservation, really to change the game, to bend the curve, right? That's what we want these days. That's what we expect. And the tradition has been, you do have these cultures that are able to sustain biodiversity, and there's this possibility that we can go beyond the industrial. A lot of societies are starting to see this recovery. It's a real thing, right? The wolf is back in Europe. This is a hard species to live with. It's still very controversial, but it's partly because the cuts net curve. Most people are urban people now in Europe, and they love wolves. And well, the rest of the Europeans are going to have to deal with the wolves because of the urban people. There's this big change in culture happening about nature. This lion, I think this is the one that actually did die from getting hit by a car. But the bottom line is, people in LA, this is a great article, by the way, if you ever get to read it. This lion and a few others like it are being protected. They're allowed to breed through the use of a bridge that will cost millions of dollars. It's just for them. It's just for them, millions of dollars. So when people really want to do this stuff, the world changes. Okay, so now we even have the UN declaring a right to a clean and healthy nature. And so when we think about this clean and healthy nature, this aspirational relationship to a better nature, we're familiar with nature's contributions to people. Nature can do stuff for us. But the real question is, what can we do for nature, right? Well, how can we change that game? How would you even think about it? Well, it happens when we take responsibility. That's the number one thing. You got to take responsibility for pollution. Take responsibility for climate change. You can't let nature solve this problem for you. It's about what we do. So we need to make space for nature. We need to care for the other beings. We need to care for the environments and end the pollution of environments. We need to bring the aspiration for a healthy, clean environment for the rest of life into what it means to have a better future for humans. That needs to be the aspirational change that needs to evolve. And let us never forget that we are completely connected to the rest of the biosphere. We are sharing the biosphere as we go. We're not 100% human. You're about 80%, maybe 90% at the most human. The rest of you, the species that live in you and on you. And we can restore these relationships, right? We're not stuck with the extinction of experience. We can bring this back. It's up to our cultures to do this. All right, thank you. Sorry for going over.
So thank you so much. Let's take some questions.
Thanks, it was a great talk. I was interested in your example of China, and I was wondering, first part, what caused that shift? Was it intentional? And then the second part is, I think pandas can be quite an easy example, but what about things that are culturally relevant in terms of destruction of nature? So traditional medicines and things like that, has the attitude shifted on that as well?
Well, it's not a simple story, except for maybe one basic aspect, which is in 1990, most Chinese people were poor and were just trying to work their way to, middle class was way beyond where most people were in 1990. That's really changed, right? So people gain leisure time. It's one thing. People have time to think about other things than just, being able to send your kids to school. That's something that you start being able to do, things like that. And so this process of kind of satisfying a lot of the developmental needs leads to people interested in other things. And some of it's even as simple as leisure stuff like bird watching, which happens to be profoundly important here, right, in this building, eat life and all this goes. This is stuff that really drives a lot of it, right? Bird lovers. And so there's a lot of that in China, for example. So I think it's this kind of progression that you see, and it becomes cool. It becomes like what people aspire to, is to have these kind of experiences and relationships. It adds value to life. So I think that's kind of the general pattern. With that particular example about in an early stage, right, the traditional medicines are aspirational too. So as you get wealthier, if you can buy those things, that is added value to from your perspective. And people are, but that's changing, right? Now, if you're really a hip influencer in China, it's not cool anymore to have, tiger bones in your medicine. And people are starting to come out. So it's just a shift. It's a little like, it was really cool to work at the coal power plant, and, the coal dust was acceptable because now you had electricity for the very first time. And once grew up with electricity, it's no longer cool to have air pollution. And so it's kind of this transitional process.
I'm Jakub Kranenberg from Poland. Aren't you a bit over-optimistic? Because the talk is about global problems and still you sound very optimistic. You say that we are in the moment to act, of course, but then that there are so many reasons for hope that it's enough to just allow for mosaic landscapes and so on. But at the same time, it's the growth of affluence that you just gave as an example of something that is positive and that changes people's attitudes that drives the problems. When you say that we are so interconnected, it again refers to who are we? And of course, we sitting here have this experience, but 98% of people in the world have never flew an airplane. So the we is really a bit misleading. And I'm wondering, what is this optimism here from?
Well, first of all, one thing I have in my mind, and everyone has kind of conceptions of what the future could be like. And I don't have a utopian belief. Okay, the future is not going to be different than the present time. Is it a utopia today? No, right? We've got lots of issues today. Was it a utopia 100 years ago? No. There was always challenges, there was always problems. That's not going to change in the future. It's never going to be a utopia. Can we build a future that is better than what we are building now? Definitely we can. We already have built a future that is better than the past in a lot of ways. And the question is, what do we intend to build? I'm not going to say there's no inevitability here. There's no inevitably better future, but the possibilities of a better future and the opportunities for a better future are really clear. They exist. And if we don't believe in them, there will be no better future. You have to start with a belief that there is a possibility that we do have the capabilities, right? You can't start with the idea that you can't do it. You start with the idea that it could be done. And then you can work toward the best thing you can get. Who knows? I don't know whether the future could achieve these things. But I do know it's absolutely possible and that we have the capabilities. And anyone who says we don't is just giving up or being a denier of the realities of the human world. The human world can do this. This question about we, though, is the best question and the biggest question, right? Because there's been a lot of fighting about this, right? The rich taking from the poor, not just helping the poor, right? There's plenty of that. There's plenty of these challenges, right? Like, is development going to work for everyone? Or is it going to remain as lopsided as it is now? Well, the good news is, if you do look at the trends, and it's even true now, there was a dip during the pandemic, but it does appear that there's less and less people living in deep poverty, and the possibilities of pulling the rest of people out of deep poverty are very real. And it's really just a matter of investment and caring to make it happen. It's totally feasible. And so this possibility of transitioning is real. Whether it'll occur is really, again, it's up to what human societies do. But if you really want to see the rest of nature become the #1 priority of humanity, you're going to have to see the development that will support that. That transition is not optional. But there is this phase of going through that, right, where you do end up building a lot of stuff. Actually, we don't have much time, but there's a really interesting new thing that I saw, and I see a lot of talks about development recently, is that one of the big failings right now of development is that in Africa and other areas of the developing world that are not experiencing these industrial transition, they are not seeing the manufacturing growth and these other things that tend to lead to this, like what made China go through the industrial transition, right? That stuff's not seeming to catch on in these other countries. That's a little scary for the development folks, because that is really the only way that anyone's got out of poverty is that way. The idea that there's just like this other path is a nice idea, but it's never been actually realized. There is this other path that people are seeing though, but again, it depends on the perspectives of everyone in the world, which is about the pathway of remittances, emigration and remittances, and things like Philippines, where people are trained up to be nurses and going to other countries that are richer and sending back money. That's another form of development. Whether it's capable of scaling up to pull everyone out of poverty is a completely open question. But the talk that I saw showed the possibilities there. It was interesting that there might be a pathway not through industry toward this better economy, this better development state. But again, these are things that are, I don't know the answer whether it's going to happen, but I do feel like if people are still living in poverty, you're still going to see huge challenges of this kind. If everyone's living in a wealthier world, it's going to be quite different. People's priorities will be very different.
What would it look like to make conservation cool from a pro-social perspective?
I am not an expert on that subject. I do know some people who are very focused on that. In the United States, which, there was a time when conservation was not cool. And then it became cool in stages. And she studies that. And it is really interesting, kind of, it's very similar to that chart I showed before. I guess it was this one, right? Like first is this preservative kind of model. It's like preserving the past, is backward looking. And then it becomes kind of like, we can do better. We can actually have some stuff back. And it's also kind of backward looking, but then rewilding is kind of a whole new aspiration. It's very different than the other aspirations. It's not to say it necessarily will take over or it's even the best thing, but the aspirations do evolve and become much more ambitious generally. It's not good enough just to, do the old thing.
So once again, thank you so much.
All right.
Thanks
Thank you.
everyone to. Bye.
Very